Every wreck on the bottom of the lake has a story to tell of people and places, victories and defeats, experiences, memories, dreams, tales of rescue or tragedy.
Dixon, Illinois, here's one of your own fighting men of the United States Navy. He's attached to a great fighting carrier. He's speaking to you from somewhere in the Marianas where he was flown especially for a series of broadcasts. His name, Lieutenant J.G. Grant C. Young. Just about where did you live there in Dixon, Grant?
Well, I live in the country just outside of Dixon.
And have any names calling Grant out here today?
No, they call me Jack.
In the final months of the Pacific War, the momentum in the South Pacific had shifted in favor of the U.S. American soldiers and sailors fought and won one battle after another, reclaiming territory from the Japanese forces and pushing the front ever closer to Japan. Japan savagely defended each occupied island to the last man. However, their losses continued to mount. The U.S. needed Okinawa's long airfield and anchorages as a staging area from which to strike at Japan.
Our targets for Torpedo 10 was the airfields to try to blow up fuel farms, rows of airplanes and revetments, or pocket the runway. We took off preliminary to the movement of troops ashore. And our fighter pilots made their sweeps ahead of us, and they couldn't catch anything in the air that day, but they caught airplanes sitting on the runway or on the revetments and machine gunned them. And I had the thought, it was Easter Sunday, what would Jesus think or say if watching us do this? We're going in to kill some humanity and blow up some stuff. And then I went ahead and spread my bombs across the revetments and the hangar and escaped. We didn't lose any planes, didn't even pick up any bullet holes that day, and returned to our carrier. Then the next day we followed, when the troops began coming ashore, why they had some escort carriers with them, and they had a couple of them had Marine fighter squadrons on board that were providing air cover, combat air patrol over the invasion forces. And we had assigned targets again on the island, looking for weapons caches, concentration of Japanese troops, and so forth.
The scale of the invasion of Okinawa rivaled that of D-Day. This final major ground assault against Japan took months to plan. In a desperate attempt to defend Okinawa, Japan sent hundreds of suicide planes in a sustained series of crushing attacks against U.S. ships. One such suicide attack under Japan's Operation Tengo involved 350 kamikazes. U.S. fighter squadrons flew patrols virtually around the clock to intercept the suicide planes.
The kamikazes are really pouring down on us. And we have a picket destroyer out ahead about 50 miles who would give you the first alarm that they were coming. And they sank 2 or 3 of those destroyers, I think, and damaged a lot of them. They would hit them first. So our combat air patrol would be up and they would fly up to meet them. And they were coming so thick that they decided to put the torpedo bombers and the dive bombers out of harm's way in the hangar deck and just fly our fighters so they could combat all these waves of kamikazes.
During the Okinawa invasion, an American submarine patrolling off Japan's coast spotted a task force of Japanese battleships steaming away from the main islands and heading out to sea. At the center of the group was the battleship Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Navy. The 72,000-ton Yamato was the largest battleship at sea in early April of 1945. Her sister ship, the Musashi, had been sunk in a recent battle. The Yamato's 9 powerful 18-inch guns were unmatched by any in the U.S. Navy. They could hurl a 3,200-pound armor-piercing shell at targets more than 25 miles away. The big guns made the Yamato one of the world's most feared ships. It was joined by a cruiser and several destroyers. It was clear to the U.S. command that by their direction the Japanese task force intended to enter the Okinawa conflict. What the Americans did not know, however, was that the Yamato had barely enough fuel to reach Okinawa. It had been dispatched on a grand-scale, one-way suicide mission that desperately sought to destroy all U.S. Navy ships between them and Okinawa. When and if they completed this, their next order was to beach the Yamato and use the ground as a base from which to blast away at the American attackers with her colossal guns. She would also send most of her 3,500-man crew aground to help defend the island. The Yamato and other members of the task force were to pull out all the stops in their attempt at victory and glory, or die trying. Intercepting the Yamato before she reached Okinawa became critical. How critical? Enough to assign 3 task forces, each with 4 aircraft carriers. More than 400 carrier planes were assigned to search out and destroy the Yamato and her escorts. That's about 100 more than the Japanese used to attack Pearl Harbor. One of the torpedo bombers was flown by Lieutenant Jack Young.
Boy, it was to the firewall. We all got ready to go because we knew it. And he had tracked them for a while, and they were all headed south and coming up to a pretty high rate of speed. So we knew they were trying to get into the invasion fleet. We knew we could catch them at sea. That's best away from their shore stations where you got a lot of anti-aircraft fire at sea to support them. And we loaded up.
Dropping a torpedo from the air by itself was a bit of a self-sacrificing act. To get into firing position, the plane eventually had to level off at low altitude and fly straight at and dangerously close to their target. The heavy torpedo prevented the plane from flying at top speed during attacks. This vulnerability resulted in heavy casualties for American torpedo bombers until experience taught them to attack in unison with dive bombers and fighters. When airborne, the 10th Squadron formed up and headed in the direction where the Japanese fleet had been spotted earlier in the day. They were in the 3rd wave of the attack. Through his window, Lieutenant Young looked down on the bare ocean. The gray clouds racing by under his wing tempted his mind to wander. The USS Wolverine and USS Sable were converted Great Lakes steamers acquired by the Navy in 1942. Originally known as the C&B and Greater Buffalo, their superstructures, which formerly housed luxurious living quarters, restaurants, ballrooms, and lounges, were removed. Their hulls were capped, this time with flat-top landing decks that extended far beyond the former hull's bow and stern. The idea of converting older ships into carriers was not a new one. However, their service in Lake Michigan was unique. They were the brainchild of then U.S. Navy Commander Richard Whitehead, a Chicagoan. Putting training carriers on Lake Michigan achieved more than one important objective.
We had a definite submarine menace off of both coasts. Then Captain Whitehead conceived the idea of, well, we can drive jeep carriers in the Lake Michigan just as well as not. And I don't know how he came upon the idea of converting these little old cargo or transport ships into carriers. But they did it in, I think in about 3 months' time. They took them into a yard somewhere and welded the gear into them and onto them, and there they went.
The Wolverine had 4 coal-fired boilers and compound reciprocating engines. Its 2 side wheels could propel the carrier up to 28 knots. Its deck measured 500 feet by 98 feet, and it had a draft of only 15.5 feet, a fraction of the height of conventional carriers. Most of the crew of 270 did not live in the vessel, so berthing in other facilities were minimal. Since the planes that landed on her decks returned to the mainland the same day, there was no hangar space. The mission of both makeshift carriers was simple: to safely land, refuel, and relaunch hundreds of airplanes each day. Besides naval pilots, the 2 carriers were used also to train new landing signal officers, or LSOs, and other carrier crewmen. The Wolverine was commissioned August 12 of 1942. She was joined a little less than a year later by the Sable, commissioned May 8 of 1943. The Sable, 535 feet long with a beam of 58 feet, was slightly longer and narrower than the Wolverine and a few feet closer to the waterline. Becoming a pilot was something Jack Young had dreamed about since he was a child. The path to achieving his dream had many steps. For starters, Jack the enlisted man had to make the grade as an officer. Next came basic flight training, then simulated carrier landing practices on land. Before assignment as a full-fledged carrier pilot, the final step was carrier qualification. It called for 8 successful landings on a real carrier. Ensign Young's first 5 landings went smoothly. It was shortly after he took off from the Wolverine's deck once more, however, that his luck abruptly changed.
I went through my checks and they gave me a go, and I took off down the deck and made my clearing turn. And just before I was ready to turn, it got silent. I mean, suddenly there was the bark, bark, stop. And, engine failure. So immediately I go into my emergency routine of checking fuel, the mag's on, or it had been running, you know. And I looked over everything, and I changed tanks, and the primer, the fuel pump was already on. We turned our emergency fuel pump on whenever we got into a landing mode. So it was on already. It had been on right along. And it looked like there was fuel pressure. But I was going down, and pretty soon I had to concentrate. I knew it wasn't going to start. I just knew that. And I looked out, and I couldn't see the propeller turning. And I don't know if it was frozen in place. By now I'm watching the water getting ready to land. And I had run out that tail hook. So I brought it down to about 85 and began hauling the stick back. And when I felt the tail hook begin dragging in the water, I snapped it. And that stalled it out completely. It made the tail come down and hit the water a good solid lick. And then rotated it forward, whop. And it just plunged solid, big spray of water come up, and then it bobbed up level, floating level for a minute or two. I undid my harness, my seat belt, and my shoulder harness, and I got up and stood out on the wing, and I got my life raft, this 4-man life raft, came out of a bay right there back of the cockpit, spread it on the wing. And I was encouraged. I said, I'm not even going to get my watch wet. And I sat down in the middle of that rubber boat, yanked the lanyard, and it went, kind of. That was it. There was no CO2 in that bottle. And it kind of crinkled up, and so there I am. And that was about the time I looked back and I saw the crash boat coming. Phenomenal sight. Meanwhile, the engine, the heavy engine of the plane is beginning to tilt it down, and the water's beginning to come up onto the wing, so I stood up. He got almost up to the tail, which is now beginning to, I'm standing on the knife edge of the wing practically, on the trailing edge of the wing, and he stopped it, and it was quiet. The engines were dead. Couldn't hear a thing. Right away, the wind began to drift them away a little bit, and the swell in the lake was running about, I'd say, 2 to 3 feet, and the thing began to turn sideways, sideways in the swell. And this sailor come out, and it was a sheet of ice. The ship was, the crash boat was just a solid ice boat. But they had these hand lines strung around on the bow and around the sides, and this sailor came out. He had a life ring and a rope on it, and he tried to throw it to me. He said, come on, he can't get it started. You got to come to us. We can't get to you. And I said, okay. So I leaped out as far as I could off of the trailing edge of that wing, which is almost vertical by now. And as soon as I hit the water, I kicked off these sheepskin flying boots I was wearing and began swimming full out toward that boat. And it wasn't until I was about halfway there that I realized I couldn't feel my legs anymore. It was just one of those things that went away. I couldn't feel my legs, but I kept swimming with my upper body was still pulling and swimming. So I kept pulling till I got to the side of that boat, got my hands over this boatswain's ladder, they call it, hanging down off of the side of the boat. I locked my hands on that above. It had little wooden steps built into it. I got above one of those wooden steps and locked my hands as tight as I could. And the boat was rocking, and it would rock me down under the water a little bit. And then it would pull me up out of the water a little bit, and then it was rocking and rocking. And this sailor looking down from up above the deck said, "Come on, get up out of there, it's cold out here." I couldn't talk to him. I really wanted to talk to him. I wanted to tell him about his parentage, but luckily the chief of the boat was a skilled hand, and he came out with a coil of fresh, warm rope and directed these two men to hold his feet, hold his ankles, while he skinnied down over the side of the boat and caught me with his line and lashed some kind of a tight fitting on me, and then they hoisted me up. I'm inert by this time, really. The only thing I could move was my eyes, and they skated me into the cabin and laid me out and immediately began to peel all my clothes off of me. And I could hear too. I could roll my eyes and I could hear good, you know. And so I'm laying there in my back. And they pulled my skivvies. They pulled every stitch of clothes off of me, and I'm laying there stark naked. And I hear this man talking, and I look up and I could see, well, he's a lieutenant commander, and he's a doctor. I could see his medical fixture on his collar. So, and he's arguing with the chief about his boat handling. And then that's when he said, "Look at that man, Chief. He's going to die, and it's your fault." He pointed right in his face, in the chief's face. And he was trying to get the motor started, see? And then the doctor went to work, and he had his people. They were patting me and rubbing me. They were massaging me, beating me, trying to get the blood to the surface, I guess. And the doctor came to me with a syringe full of something, and I cringed inwardly, but I couldn't cringe really because I was petrified practically. And he stuck me in the shoulder cap with that and shot that stuff into me. And then I began to feel tingly, and my toes, I could feel my toes tingly. I couldn't quite move them, and my fingers was tingling, and all over my skin. I felt, you know, needly. And he brought a glass of something that I figured must have been liquor, some kind of liquor, and he cradled my head and said, "See if you can swallow some of this." So I went glug glug, and I could. I swallowed a couple swallows of that stuff. I couldn't taste it. Didn't have any sensation of burning or anything like that. But I bet it wasn't down there more than 3 or 4 microseconds, and boom, it came back up at him. And he said, "Ah, that's a good sign. His insides are working."
He completed his remaining 3 landings for carrier qualification the next day, this time on the deck of the Sable, signed out for leave, and grabbed a train home to Dixon, Illinois, to marry his childhood sweetheart, Ethel, whom he had known since he was 8 years old, and who grew up in the house across the road from his farm.
When he got off the train, I looked at him and couldn't believe it. His pants were halfway up to his knees. And I thought it was funny, and I stood there laughing. I had no idea that he'd come within a hair of losing his life and had had an accident. To me, it was just funny to see this officer standing there with his pants halfway to his knees. And then I heard the rest of the story.
It was that quick drying on those manifolds that shrunk that pair of pants down. And I walked off, and these were wool worsted trousers, beautiful green uniform trousers, and they must have shrunk up 3 inches in every direction. So luckily I hadn't filled them out this way anyway, but here I am stepping off, and I've got these high water pants. I had left my other uniforms over the weekend at my home there near Dixon.
It took a little while for the seriousness of what had happened out in Lake Michigan a few days earlier to hit home.
One of the little carriers was out there. Oh, you could see it. It was only about 15 miles off the pier there. I just suddenly had that haunted feeling. Ethel and I are looking, I think we must have been on about the 15th floor of the Stevens Hotel. And with the haunted feeling came that thought that I had been spared to get on that rescue craft, and that I'd be all right.
All at once, the vacant ocean was cluttered with miles of warships blasting away at the attacking planes. The Japanese ships fought desperately to repel the attack. The sound of propeller engines was now joined by the racket of anti-aircraft bursts, bombs, and rockets.
My task group was the third one to strike the fleet. So the other two task groups had already hit it by the time we got there. The weather was deteriorating all the time though. Heavier overcast, rain. Our Air Group Commander Highland was flying a Corsair and directing traffic, you might say. When we arrived approaching the fleet, he went on ahead of us, he and his wingman, and could see that these ships had been damaged by these other forces, see. And the Yamato itself had been hit. They recorded 6 torpedo hits on it already, and a number of 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. Several of these 11-inch Tiny Tim rockets, which was a cannon shell in front of a rocket body. Good weapon. The fighters carried those. So as we approached, he had directed us. It looks like it's only making about 5 knots, he said, and it's listing to starboard already pretty good. He said, let's just leave that for the submarine to take over and kill.
There was one problem, however. Jack's torpedo had been preset to dive to 22 feet to get below the Yamato's hull armor. And though it was possible to reset the torpedo in flight, the turbulence and wild flying to evade enemy fire prohibited doing this. They attempted, but failed.
My 6 planes wound up on the port side of the Yamato, and we split and went this way. We just split around the fleet as we approached it, and the dive bombers were overhead getting ready. And when Commander Highland said, "Go," we started our attack. And there's some gunner on some ship, or more than one, I don't know, but there are these suddenly in front of me. He thought I was going faster than I was, I guess, because the explosion was right at my altitude, but, 500 feet ahead of me. And I waited till the second one, and I knew it's come a little closer, and I knew he's on me, so I pulled up momentarily to get out of sight. I ducked into the cloud, and I stayed in the cloud too long. Just when I ducked back out of the cloud, I'm right on top of that destroyer I had my eye on. I'm inside of the destroyer escort ring, and there it is, right in my face. And I thought that I couldn't make a 180-degree turn or a 360-degree circle and come back. The rest of my people, they're going in, so I just went to the water. I floorboarded. I stop cocked the throttle on the thing, revved RPM up to 2,400, and went down to the 200 feet. And then here it comes. There's these streaks of anti-aircraft fire going by me all sides. So I'm doing this. I'm jinxing all over the sky to give them a hard target. But there comes a time when you have to stabilize at altitude, on speed, and I'd already set my torpedo director for the correct lead at 5 knots and my angle of approach. So I had to stabilize at 200 feet. I had to center my ball so I wasn't skidding or slipping. Center the ball in my instrument so that I'm flying a true course. And you have to do that and hold it. Let the gyro in the torpedo stabilize itself from all this flying around the sky I had been doing. And pickle. And then I went through the deal again. When I let go of that torpedo, of course, I felt light as a feather again, and I yanked it around, and the rest of my squadron had retired to the front of the force, but where I was, I had to go to the biggest avenue of escape was to after the Yamato. So I peeled around right over her bow and headed straight aft of it, and I kept jinxing, expecting to get a wing blown off or something. My gunner sitting in the ball turret looking backward could watch it. I couldn't see it. And he said, "It's running true. It's running true. We're going to hit him right around the anchors," he said. Well, no, he says he's moving on. It's going to hit him amidships probably. Oh, he kept giving me these readings. And by the time I got outside of the screen where that destroyer couldn't shoot at me anymore, he said, "There it is, it hit, it exploded." He says, "Right under the gun turret, looks like." And I yanked around enough, and all I could see by that distance was just big splash of water and smoke going up in the air. They figured that since the ship was heeled over starboard at 5 degrees, and that my torpedo at 22 feet, if it run true, got under his armor belt and hit somewhere between the armor belt and the keel. Because Commander Highland, flying his wonderful Corsair around overhead watching all this and taking photographs, by the way, he took some good photographs. He said the thing had begun to rock when the torpedo went off. It blew it over on the starboard side and then began to oscillate back and forth very slowly and ponderously, and it was still moving forward, and it rolled over just a little further, he said. And if he ever knew how many cycles it made, he didn't say, but he said finally it rolled over and went over on clear over on its side and stopped there a little bit, and then it continued rolling over completely upside down. And he said the big screws were big. There were 4 screws, he said, propellers. He said they were still turning in the air when it was completely upside down, capsized. And then he said it hesitated there again. He thought 10, 15, 20 seconds. He wasn't timing it, taking pictures. He said suddenly there was this tremendous explosion. And he said it just blew a big smoke ring and a big column of flame and smoke into the air over it. And he said by the time that smoke cleared, it was gone.
Lieutenant Young and his crew were commended for the death blow they dealt to the Yamato. Their bravery and actions that day earned a citation from the fleet commander, Admiral Mitcher, and later the U.S. Navy Cross for Jack Young. Even though his plane returned him safely to his carrier after the Yamato attack, it turned out that it had suffered more shrapnel hits and damage than he had initially thought.
Here it's got all these perforations in it. There was Jeep carriers out there resupplying brand new airplanes of all kinds. They just didn't have the wherewithal to do that much patching on an airplane, so whoever was in charge of that part of it said, we don't want to work with this thing, over the side with it, so they pushed it over the side.
The U.S. victory at Okinawa came at a very high price. The Japanese sank 30 American ships, damaging some 300 more. Thousands of soldiers were killed, injured, or missing. When Okinawa had been claimed, American forces' attention shifted to plans for an all-out invasion of Japan.
Our mission was going to be to go up right off of Honshu and to try to kill off kamikaze bases. That we were going to be the first wave in the assault on the home islands. And we were playing basketball on the hangar deck of the Intrepid. And captain come over what we called the 1MC, the all-ship radio announcer, and said, "Men, this is the captain. Give me your attention, please." And then without further preamble, he said, "The war is over. The Japanese have capitulated. The war is over, and we're home free." He says, "I don't know what our orders will be. Over and out." And we had stopped playing basketball, of course, when we heard it's the captain speaking. So we just stood there in the basketball court, laid off on the hangar deck, and there were people working on airplanes fore and aft. And we kind of looked around at each other, and nobody cheered. There was no hurrah, hurrah. I felt like crying, and I know that a couple people in my squadron did cry, with the thought that they would never have to fly through any aircraft again.
I think I was at work and heard it. We knew once the atom bomb was dropped that it was going to end. We just knew that was the turning point. When they dropped the atom bomb, I said, that is what we were doing. I had no idea before that. I hadn't put what we were ordering and what we were doing together. I had never heard of an atom bomb, and as far as I know, they hadn't split the atom, and I had no idea that this is what they were working on.
On August 14, 2001, volunteers head out into Lake Michigan aboard the power cruiser Intrigue. In addition to dive gear, they have aboard underwater video equipment. They are heading to the coordinates where a sunken World War II airplane rests on the bottom of the lake. It is a Grumman Avenger, TBF number 06064. In fact, the same plane that Ensign Jack Young struggled in vain to keep airborne when the engine died shortly after takeoff, one frosty day in December of 1943. His lost plane was discovered 51 years later in 1994. For years, a salvage team working under the direction of the National Museum of Naval Aviation's historic aircraft recovery program has searched for airplanes lost in Lake Michigan during the 2.5 years that the USS Wolverine and USS Sable training exercises occurred. The team has located several planes, some of which have been raised, restored, and put on display in museums around the country. Aboard today also is retired U.S. Navy Captain Jack Young. He is astounded that someone actually had found his lost Avenger, and anxious to see it again after so many years.
There's the propeller broken off. As near as I can tell, the end of the blades are not bent. So it was not pulling when it hit the water. Just past the cockpit, and now you're in the second. This was the second cockpit, and this is where the ball turret used to reside that they had removed, and there was just a plexiglass housing over that area. Now you're coming back to the tail of it, and the fin. The vertical stabilizer has broken forward, part of it, and there you have the horizontal stabilizers, and of course the elevators are rotted off by now, and the rudder, they were fabric, I think. And that's the vertical stabilizer that the rudder used to be fastened to, and it's going off. And now we're coming back toward the front of the airplane again. It's barely distinguishable as an airplane, although it does have the plan form of it. Now you can see the hinges where the elevators used to be fastened. You're seeing the fuselage there. That's the fuselage. That was the hatch to get into on the right side of the fuselage where the radio man and radar compartment was. Now you're coming back up where the ball turret was. It was a 50 caliber machine gun that the ball turret had. You had a gunner to fight off airplanes, shoot at enemy airplanes. I've always wondered about that. I wondered if I'd lost the propeller, and because it wasn't pulling me, that's for sure. And I don't know, it made this kind of growling noise at the beginning, and I've always thought it might have been the reduction gears in the nose cone, but I don't know. I'd tell you, I moved the throttle back and forth and everything. I moved every lever in that airplane trying to get some life built back in it. No luck. You see that encrustation of zebra mussels on it. To look at it in that condition and see that layer of crud on it was disappointing. But then I recall you were swimming around with the lights and the cameras, photographing it from various aspects, and slowly you wound your way up to the cockpit area. And just at that time, that young lady that was with us that day asked the question, "Well, what are your impressions?" And all I could tell her was, "I'm just glad I'm not sitting in that cockpit."
I did not know his name was Grant until he graduated from high school. And I had met him in the 5th grade. And his name, he'd gone to school as Jack. He was on the football team as Jack. And then he graduated from high school, and they gave him this diploma to Grant Young. Who's Grant Young? I'd never heard of his name before that. He didn't do any more than anybody else out there. His whole life, plus he loved what he was doing. He loved to fly. And he had one thing I'm proud of, he had a wonderful influence on these boys. He was an enlisted man himself before he was an officer. So he had a wonderful rapport with his men. And even, I was on board ship one time, and one of them, he suggested he go to school and all, and he had come back and hunted him up. He was out of the Navy. He had hunted him up to tell him what an influence he'd had on his life. And that meant more to me than some of these medals.